Okay, so can you guys see my slides? Okay, so just now we are looking at part 2 of the fiscal policy. We went through the first part last week. Now we are going through the second part. So now we're just looking at fiscal policy and practice in South Africa. So now we're using the fiscal policy and we are looking at the different practices that are in South Africa. So we're looking at debt, deficits, doom or deliverance. Okay. So guys, as I said, there's literally there's no graphs here. So it's just notes. I know that by the end of my video, there's literally going to be like 4 people or 5 people. Okay, so the origins of fiscal policy. So you guys know that fiscal policy is greatly related to Keynes. So before the Great Depression of the 1930s, so remember the Great Depression of the 1930s, fiscal issues were largely concerned with accounting issues and the administration of the government budget. So it wasn't so much as what fiscal policies entail right now. So it was mostly about accounting issues. How much is the country making? How much is the country spending? And yeah. So the effects of budgetary decisions by government on the macro economy of South Africa gained ground from the middle of the 1950s, and anti-cyclical fiscal policy was generally recognized as acceptable practice during the 1960s and the early 1970s. So it's like a history of when the fiscal policy became popular in South Africa. So a rapid increase in government spending was experienced during the first half of the 1970s. So Brown refers to this period as years of fiscal expansion. So remember that when we talk about fiscal expansion, we are talking about government expenditure increasing. Okay, so both consumption and investment spending by the South African government generally increased, and government expenditure as a whole increased from 19.6% of gross domestic expenditure in 1970 to 25.1% of gross domestic expenditure in 1976. So government consumption expenditure usually includes a remuneration of employees. So that's the government's wage bill, how much the members of parliament get paid, how much the ministers get paid, the purchase of other goods and services. So stationery, uniforms, medicine, vehicles. Government consumption expenditure is a part of the government's current expenditure. So investment expenditure is mainly fixed capital investment in infrastructure and other fixed capitals assets. So that's when the government is building roads, building schools, building hospitals and stuff. Yeah, that is known as investment expenditure. Okay, so the major change in fiscal policy stance was attributed to, firstly, the widely held view that increases in government spending was a major cause of the increase in inflation rates during the first half of the 1970s. So when the inflation rate started increasing and became more prominent, they started looking at the government expenditure. And then this view was supported by theoretical developments. So also the second one was conditions that were attached to an International Monetary Fund loan to South Africa obtained in the early 1976. So you guys know that the government usually borrows money from the IMF in order to fund its expenditure. I think we recently this year, we also got like a lot of money. I don't know whether the 500 billion came from the IMF or not. So there are usually conditions that are usually attached to the loans that we get from outside. So those conditions can sometimes enforce fiscal policy implementations, or they can have fiscal policy and both monetary policy implications. Okay. So remember, we are just going through the South African history on how they came about using the fiscal policy and how they implemented the fiscal policy. And we're just looking at the practical side. Okay. So theoretical developments that led to a restrained fiscal approach being adopted. So remember, it's easy for a country to just, the government to just spend, you know how we were just demanding free education not so long ago. We're like, no, the government must give us money, the government must give us free education, the government must do this, the government must do that. But then that money has to come somewhere. It has to come from somewhere. So it's not always that the government will have enough money to cover all those expenses. Okay, so amongst the corruption that they do, yeah, the alleged corruption, let me not just say things and put things out there that I have no proof of, but yeah, amongst the alleged corruption that they do, and the unnecessary spending that they do, the government will lose money. Okay, so usually a restrained fiscal policy will have to be adopted because the government can spend and spend, and we all know that you cannot spend money that you don't have. So what happens is that when they don't have the money, then they go outside and they borrow the money. Then the country becomes a country that's in a lot of debt. And then if you are in a lot of debt, then I mean, how is economic growth going to proceed? Okay, so classical and monetarist concerns about the restrained fiscal approach. Monetarists argued that rapid increases in money supply in order to finance government spending will be highly inflationary. So remember that an increase in money supply will increase the price level. So we recall that the quantity theory of money from the old classical school, an increase in MV will equal to an increase in PY. So monetarists in the 1950s and the 1960s, in the long run, basically said that an increase in money supply in order to fund government expenditure will be highly inflationary. Okay. And okay, the Keynesian concerns was that given the nature of the inflationary process, tax increases could no longer be regarded as an instrument of anti-inflationary policies. You cannot keep increasing tax. It doesn't make sense that let's say now the government taxes you 50%, So basically you're working, if let's say your gross salary is supposed to be 50,000 and then you have to give 25 thousand to the government. That wouldn't be an incentive to work, because why not just sit at home and just get government grant or something. Okay, so government spending had to be kept in check, since increasing the tax burden associated with increased government spending could give further impetus to inflation. Okay, are there any questions? So guys, another thing that you guys can just take note of is that, so remember in South Africa, you need to understand that post-apartheid, a lot of the majority of people living in South Africa, I know that a lot of people are just always like, but then you can't keep blaming apartheid, you know, for the imbalances and inequality and whatnot. Like how long, for how long are we going to milk this cow? But the reality is that the reason why we are where we are right now, besides the corruption, the alleged corruption, is the fact that the post-apartheid government had to fix a lot of imbalances of the past. They had to fix a lot of inequalities and so many, the majority of um, the people in the country were disadvantaged then. So now, coming post-apartheid, now they have to put reforms where they have to better the lives of their citizens. And in order to do that, the government has to spend. But then now, do you focus on bettering the lives of your people, or are you going to look at the fact that, oh my goodness, now I'm spending more and I need to enforce fiscal restraints? So it becomes a matter that's really complicated, because the government needs to spend in order to better the lives of its citizens. But at the same time, they can't spend too much, because then they run into budget deficits. So I don't know, it's complicated. Okay, so fiscal restraints preached but not practiced. So fiscal restraints, so remember fiscal restraints, that's when we are trying to increase tax collections, increase revenues, and decrease spending. So fiscal restraint was initially maintained in South Africa. So fiscal restraint from the 1976 to 1980 was attributed to a curtailment of investment spending by government, a fall in the real remuneration of government employees, and strong cyclical upswings that allowed tax revenue to increase. So basically what happened was government spent more on investments, and there was a fall in how much government, basically public workers, how much they were earning. I don't think any of the ministers would allow their salaries to be cut in order to, you know, to fix the budget issues here in South Africa. So there was a fall in government employees' wages, and there was a strong cyclical upswing in tax collection. So yeah, from 1976 to 1980. So government expenditure restraint remained a key feature of fiscal strategies in the 1980s and in the 1990s, but it was not maintained. Okay, so as you can see, let me see. So as you can see from the 1980s, there are points where it decreased, And then there are points where it just increased. So there was up and down movements. So this is government expenditure as a percentage of GDP. Okay. Okay, so moving on to the fiscal stance in post-apartheid South Africa. In the early 1990s, an ideological debate commenced in South Africa with the battle lines clearly drawn between economists with Keynesian or heterodox tendencies and those recommending more neoclassical or orthodox policy approaches. So the neoclassical or the orthodox economist refers to an approach in the tradition of the old classical school. It assumes competitive markets, rational consumers, and profit maximizing firms, and the economy is seen as functioning efficiently. So yeah. So now you know that Keynesian and the heterodox school of thought, they believe in government intervention, and then the neoclassical and the orthodox policy school of thought basically believe that the economy is functioning efficiently if left to its own. Okay, so basically the government post-apartheid developed different policies in order to fix the situation that was happening within the country. So the first one, the policy reform that they had was the Reconstruction and Development Program. So you guys, I expect you guys to know all these programs, the RDP, and I think there's also GEAR, and I'm sure there's like more on the other side, on the other notes. ASGISA, I'm also seeing the NDP, the National Development Plan, and the New Growth Path. So you guys need to know those things. Okay, so let's look at the policy reform. The RDP called for an extended government spending in order to overcome imbalances or structural problems inherent in the economy as it emerged from the apartheid era. So this program considered the reduction of income inequality as a precondition to social transformation and hence economic growth. So you guys will go through all of that. It's on page 7 to page 8. Okay. So you guys need to know also what the policy reforms are and why they failed. Okay, so you just need to go through all of that, and if there's something that you guys don't understand, then you can just let me know and I'll try and explain. But I feel like everything is just it's clear. I can't explain more and I can't explain less, basically. So you guys, you should know the 4 main reasons for the argument presented by Naidu. Basically, it was argued that the aggressive state spending policy encompassed in the RDP had to be tempered, so it had to be decreased. Are there any questions? Okay, so another policy reform is the growth, employment, and redistribution GEAR strategy. So yeah, so the GEAR strategy, basically it focused on achieving macroeconomic stability by reducing the inflation rate, the budget deficits, and the debt to GDP ratio, and creating a more competitive market. So you guys will read what all of that entails because you guys have your notes. Okay. Also, these are the arguments that were made in favor of limiting deficits. You guys will find them in your notes. Yeah. And then so basically, guys, when you guys are going through your notes that you guys have, your notes should be enough for this topic. You don't need to go back to the textbook and try and confuse yourself. So you can just use your notes to just read over everything. As I said, the most important thing are the policy reforms and why they failed, and yeah. And then, okay, so the fiscal budget outcome since 1994 had been accompanied by fiscal reform that had facilitated the reduction of the budget deficit as a percentage of GDP. This reform covered both government expenditure and government revenue. The area of reform are outlined by those two authors. Okay, so the first area was enhancing public management and fiscal oversight reforms. So in your notes, guys, they've given you some examples on how they achieved that. And then the tax reform, they've also given you notes and a detailed explanation on how they also achieved that. Okay, so as I said, this is just theory and theory and theory and theory. Okay, so the neoclassical view, the debts and deficits, doom and difficulty. So now we're looking at the crowding out argument. So do you guys know what the crowding out argument is? Yes, no. Okay, Pagamile Shandu, you can tell us what the crowding out argument is. You can unmute yourself. Okay, I'm waiting. Are you shy to speak? Okay, so basically, guys, the crowding out argument basically states that an increase in government expenditure basically crowds out, an increase in public expenditure will crowd out resources in the private sector, right? So it's important to distinguish two types of crowding out. So we have resource crowding out and financial crowding out. So basically resource crowding out, this is when the government uses resources such as labor and raw materials that would otherwise be used by the private sector. This will occur if an economy is operating at or near to full capacity. So workers cannot be in two places at once. If they work for the government, they cannot work at the same time for a private company. So this argument basically is within the context of a supply constrained economy. So basically resource crowding out is the government using resources that would have been used by the private sector. And then financial crowding out, basically this occurs when an extra government spending diverts funds from the private sector firms and thus deprives them of the finance necessary for investment. So when the government uses funds that would have been used by the private sector. So if the government spends more, it will have to borrow in order to attract people to buy government securities or put their money in national savings. The government will have to offer higher interest rates. So if they offer higher interest rates, because remember, there is a negative relationship between government bonds and the interest rate. So in order for people to buy more bonds, the government will have to push the interest rates up so that their bonds cost less. So if the interest rates is high, then what happens to the investment? Investment is going to decrease. So yeah, that's financial crowding out. So we also look at the concerns over the national debts. So the question is, does it matter if a country has persistent budget deficits and as a result builds up a large national debt as it borrows to finance deficits? So basically that's what our country is going through right now. It has, we have, I'm not sure if you guys look at our debt clock, but yeah, we're owing a lot. So much so that our interest rate on payments, I think it's round about billions. Yeah. So it's rough, guys. So the concerns over the national debts, we look at the impact on future generations. So one of the arguments put forward by those economists who answer yes to the above question is that a buildup of government debts puts a burden on future generations. So remember, guys, like let's look at South Africa. South Africa has a lot of debt, right? I think we are in the trillions, right? Who's going to have to pay for that debt? South Africa and its citizens. So in order for government to pay back that debt, what happens is that they might increase taxes in the future. So let's say 50 years from now, that will no longer be 15%. It will be, let's say, 25% if they don't get a hold of the debt situation right now. So you guys know with the corona and this pandemic, basically the government had to borrow more money. Okay, so it would have been better if that money was being used in the correct way, so that the money basically, so that the debt basically pays itself back. But then if people are buying themselves fancy cars and fancy houses, yeah, it's rough. Okay, so the impact on future generations, but then it seems that bureaucrats do not really care about that. They only care about maximizing their utility and maximizing profits. Yeah. So, okay. So the next points are the additional problems that are associated with international and domestic debts. So the first point, so the government debt can be incurred by borrowing outside the borders of the country or by borrowing at home. Both methods of borrowing are argued to be problematic for reasons over and above their effects on future generations. So looking at international government debts, the problem of accumulating a large portion of foreign debt is that a large amount of export earnings each year will be used merely to pay interest on the foreign loans. So you guys know that we're paying a lot of interest payments on our loans, and that does affect the rand. So it will affect our currency. And then the second one, you guys will go through these points. So remember, these are just points and you guys just need to read what's underneath. And then if there's something that you don't understand, then we can talk. Okay. So government borrowing from within the country. So obviously the government still has to finance the interest payments and repay or reissue the debts it requires. Building up government debt to finance continuing government deficits. So basically what they do is they borrow money so that they can finance what they're already owing. So it's not a matter of, okay, fine, I'm owing. It's like I owe, let me see one of the names here. I owe Giselle 100 rand, right? So if I owe Giselle 100 rand and then I go to Spamandla to go borrow the 100 rand so that I can pay Giselle back. So it's a continuous cycle. But had I gotten the 100 rand from Giselle and invested it to make sure that the money basically triples or it doubles, then I wouldn't have to go to Spamandla to go borrow money. I would just have, let's say I triple the money. I would have 300 rand and I would still be able to pay Giselle her money back. Yeah. Giselle is a female name. Yeah. So we are working differently. Basically, borrow money from Giselle, and then Giselle wants her money back, and then we go to Spa. And then when Spa wants his money back, we go to Spiwe. It's it's a it's a crazy cycle. It's a crazy cycle. So yeah. Are there any questions? So basically, when the government borrows from its citizens, so remember that I did one of the ways that the government can borrow from its citizens is through bonds. So remember, we went through bond financed deficit. So what happens is that in order for people to buy bonds or to make bonds attractive, the government will have to lower the price. So if they lower the price, the interest increases. So raising interest has many issues. So the first issue could be financial crowding out. The second one, it could worsen the current account on the balance of payments. It could lead to high interest rates indefinitely, and that increases the cost of debt servicing for future generations. So yeah, you guys can read that on page 16. And then fiscal sustainability in a neoclassical theory. So unsustainable fiscal policy is defined as a persistent increase in the public to debt GDP ratio. So Forey and Berger point out that it is not the same as the existence of a debt trap. So a debt trap will exist if, number one, the debt to GDP ratio is increasing. The increase in the debt to GDP ratio is at a rapid pace. And number three, there is little ability to stop the debt to GDP ratio increasing through tax increases or expenditure decreases. So you guys need to know that the conditions in which the debt trap exists. Okay. Are there any other questions? Any other questions? So